Hello, hello. Can you guys hear me? Just do a quick sound check, make sure everyone can hear me. That sounds about right. So everyone can hear me. Fantastic. Welcome to my stream. This has been a while. Obviously, I've been moving now, so got new digs. As you can see behind me, new setup. And then so what we're going to be doing today is just a little bit of something I promised within the BrisPug conference, was to do a bit of a follow-up video. We'll nickname it ZenataConf, on how I built the IT self-service portal using within that conference and within my talk. So it's 100% built from scratch. So there was no, there was obviously libraries and things like that, but ultimately there was no kind of products that I was using that basically assisted in that. So a lot of people were quite interested in understanding how that was completed, and there's a lot of more content that needs to be talked about, and how to actually get all that to work. So this is a very informal talk. There's not going to ultimately it's you can see in the well, it's 6 o'clock in the morning here, Brisbane. I'm very tired. We had a pretty bad couple of nights, so yeah, very informal talk. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. We can just take our time. We've got at least 3 hours to kind of go through all this, which is absolutely more than what anybody would potentially have in any sort of talk slot. So we can just kind of take our time and go through it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time. Hopefully we're going to go through and make sure that everyone understands the entire process end to end as best as I can describe it. So we're going to be even talking a little bit about OAUTH and how that works. I've got some demo videos from another talk which I did, which can kind of help talk about how the OAUTH user flow works, things like that. So, but anyway, first things first, what we probably want to have a quick squiz at before we want to go any further is talk about the actual layout of the code. So you guys remember the PowerPoint, so we're just pretty much going to be working with the PowerPoint. So essentially the code was built like this. You'd have our REST client, you'd have API management proxying our requests, you would have our Azure Function App, a PowerShell function app running in the background, linking with Azure Automation, and then finally we would have an Azure Logic app which is integrated with Teams, and we'd have an activity event that would be basically triggered using an approval process within our Azure function here. So it's quite simple in that sense, because everything looks simple and you can simplify it down to a couple of icons. However, it's still quite complex with a lot of things under the hood that basically allowed it to happen. And then we're going to really go through a lot of the problems that I had as well, which also causes, which also I had issues with. I had issues with. So we'll go through a lot of those. We're going to also we'll talk about how to register an Azure app a little bit more detail here, so we can actually spend a bit more time in this and things like that. So this is going to be a pretty slow going talk and with a lot of depth and content to cover. So essentially the thing that we're going to really focus on right now is we're going to be, actually, to be honest, we're going to be really focusing on the PowerShell helper first. I think this is the most critical thing for us to be able to fully articulate before we can understand this rest of this process. Now, the first thing I want to make sure you guys understand is the PowerShell helper is just a simple function app that runs concurrently with the Azure Function App, and all it does was it service requests that I needed to, that I had written in PowerShell to get things done. For instance, start a runbook, and then so start an Azure Automation runbook, things like that. So it was communicated using REST, so there was no authentication or anything like that, or OAuth authentication. It was essentially Azure API Management proxied the requests using subscriptions, which we can talk about a little bit in the future. But ultimately, that secured that specific helper from the backend as a backend service rather than a front end service. So anyway, so we're gonna start with that first, and you're gonna already meet. And as you probably already imagined, we're gonna jump into a lot. And then we're gonna jump into some DLLs as well. So it's already going to get deep really quickly. So let's go ahead and find that code. So this is the code here. So go ahead and close that. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I'm just going to go ahead and... Yep, okay, cool, that's good. So what we had in here was, this is the PowerShell helper. You can see in here, it looks like any sort of traditional function app. There's not really anything special with it. Local, it's just the same. The only thing it probably has is some additional settings, configurations, things like that. So the one thing that's probably important to remember is that the configuration for this application is derived in a PowerShell hash table. So what happens within the configurations directory within this PowerShell helper, again, this could be moved off to a blob or some sort of external configuration provider, is that you have different tiles or different within the portal constitutes different actions that you're wanting to perform. So a good example is add a user to a distribution group. So anything within the configurations directory is powered using this. Now, I'm just going to quickly go to GitHub. So if you guys actually want to get the code, I'm just going to post a link in the chat right now so we can, if you guys want to follow along, that's perfectly fine. So it's going to be under my BrizPug, under presentations, under 2020, and then if you go to PSConf, building IT self-service portal, this is all the code in here. So you can pretty much just go and take a squiz at that. So that's definitely something I recommend having a bit of a look at, because you can follow along and that helps you understand what's going on here. But everything under here, this configurations directory, is a configuration. It's a PowerShell hash table that gets compiled into JSON that basically then essentially then is used as a configuration. Now it kind of gets compiled. It's very loose. Compiled is probably the better term than serialized, because it's not a straight serialization. The way that it builds the configuration. Now, in a sense, it is, but the way that it builds there's a DLL that sits between the C# function app and the PowerShell function app, which basically acts as a C# type library, so it can deserialize too, as it's being strongly typed. And the other side of that is that basically then PowerShell can just essentially take advantage of the methods within that DLL to be able to actually construct the required configuration. So that's essentially what it does. So you can see in here, again, this is not the best, but there's a DLLs directory. We have this, what we call configuration builder core. And now we're going to start going quite deep here. So before we go into that yet, we're going to have a quick look at all the different functions. So there's three. There's get configuration, start runbook, and test configuration. So within get configuration, you have, this is the process that's responsible for actually returning all of our code or our configuration. It goes and essentially compiles the configuration into something that C# can understand. At the same time, actually, no, that's really what it does. It basically compiles the configuration into what C# can understand. So you can see here, we're basically getting our location. We're adding our, we're basically just adding the configuration builder core. It's written in .NET Core, that's why it's core. But essentially, it just builds that configuration. And you can see in here, all I'm doing is I'm creating that, I'm creating a new list item. So I've done that. I'm going through here and I'm dot sourcing these items in. So essentially what happens is it'll go through each of these PowerShell files, and then it will dot source them into this variable. So it's not dot sourcing them into the actual script itself. It's only dot sourcing them into the variable. So whatever gets returned is returned in that, and that's just the type hash table that's getting passed into that. Once that's completed, it'll then compile it, and it's going to call this add method. And so what happens here is it's going to pass these hash tables and an ID into the this method, which will then basically build me a class which we can use to actually to do what we need to do. So let's go have a look at that. So you can see here you do have, remember, if we looked at the things, we have three types of I would say areas within the hash table. I'll say, actually, we'll just say keys within the hash table. You have runbook PS object, runbook PS object, REST body, and HTML content. They're fairly self-explanatory. We'll go over it again. So runbook PS object essentially is all items that corresponds to the PowerShell runbook itself. Then you have the REST body. The REST body essentially is information that's basically pertains to what is being sent back to our endpoint. And then finally we have our HTML content, and essentially it's just your HTML elements that you're adding in here, giving it a title, owner, description, so things like that. So if we go back to our get configuration runbook, you can see here all we're doing is we're just adding it to that list up here. That's really it. And then finally, once we're done, we're then going to basically convert it to JSON. So it will serialize it as JSON. However, it won't. It's still kind of compiling it. And the reason why I did it this way was because then I know that when using the same DLL in C#, could then type it's strongly typed. So essentially, then C# could deserialize it without any issues. So let's go take a look at that DLL. So first things first, I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'm going to bring that across, and you can see in here it's a very basic DLL. There's not really much in here, so we can go ahead and close it all. Just close more. So the first thing you can see is we got our HTML. Oh, sorry, our HTML object. Is it HTML object? No. It's been so long since I've looked at this. Honestly, I can't remember which one it was. I should have called these classes a bit better. C# is not my strongest language. Okay, it's a HTML object. That's what I thought. So in here you can see we have our HTML object. It's a soup. This is just classes. There's not really much logic within here. There's just more. One of the key things that we needed to deal with was C# is not a big fan of hash tables. So I wanted to, when working with C#, I essentially wanted to make sure that everything was essentially typed the same way as it was typed in PowerShell. So in this instance, you have a hash table. That hash table is essentially the same as a hash table within PowerShell, so the same object type. And the reason why I did that was because, I wanted to make sure that both languages could effectively talk to each other without any sort of kind of added code that would kind of translate hash tables into list items or dictionary objects, and it kind of got a little messy. So I kind of just tended to stick with a single type and just have it consistent across the entire solution. So we can see in here, essentially, it's just an object class that basically has a method added in here, which is a static method. You can see this was the method that PowerShell called. And all it would do is it basically go through, create a new, essentially just go ahead and create those objects. And that was really it, and it would return the object. So it was very simple. However, it wasn't simple in that sense. So it was simple in the sense that this is a very basic class, but it wasn't simple where there was certain things that needed to be done. So for instance, if we have a look at we are at a HTML object, so it'll be HTML config. So within the HTML config class, which is the bottom component of the configuration. So if we go back here, you can see, if we have a look at configuration, this is that HTML content. So this this hash table here. What happened here essentially is, again, it's just creating a list, so we can add a range, and then within that, it's basically iterating through all the hash tables, and then it's dynamically building out, oh, it's not dynamically, but it's building out a new object of HTML. It's building out each of those specific items within that. So it's really quite straightforward in that sense. So I don't really need to go. I don't think I really need to go any further. I think this is probably the most complicated of it all. So essentially, I'm just creating a new object and passing my HTML name and all that. So element types, values. I think the hardest thing was the actual config. So if we go have a quick look at the config. Okay, that's config. So it's creating a config there. Where is converting all the bits and pieces? Content. That's what I wanted to show, is content. So when it's creating a content, again, you can see the title, the type, description, the response URL, the owners. Like, it's super basic. I don't really expect, like, it's not that complicated. But essentially, it was a key factor that allowed me to ensure that both applications could be able to communicate on a common type without having any sort of issues with serialization and deserialization. Now, admittedly, I could have just rewrote the PowerShell configuration to be basically to do the conversion into a dictionary object. That would be a better way to do it in the future. That's what I'd probably do. To be honest, I probably wouldn't use PowerShell in the future. But it's something that it's just worth mentioning anyway. So I think at the end of the day, though, it's still a really good, thing to have in place, because ultimately that really helped overcome a lot of those issues that we had initially with trying to actually be able to get those two. I had issues with those two endpoints trying to talk to each other, so I just said, stuff it. I'm just going to write a common class, and then basically that can be added to the C# application that can be used to compile within PowerShell. So that's pretty much that within the get configuration. So you can see here, it's going to call that DLL. It's basically just going to call those methods, which will construct an object. And that object, all we're doing is we're then just serializing it, converting, and then to JSON, and that's it. So it's really simple. The next one, which was quite a interesting one, was this start runbook. We'll do it this way. We're going to do it a little bit more disjointed because it helps you guys articulate what was required. So you can see here, it's very basic in the sense that, again, all we're doing is we're passing in a request. There's no sort of real authentication or anything like that, because again, it's a back-end service. To be honest, we shouldn't be, but we're just assuming and trusting our endpoint, our requester, which should be the function app, or durable function app. So essentially here, we're just basically going to try and deserialize the string. I added this here, and the reason why was because I had issues with debugging the function app, and what would happen is, by default, it should automatically deserialize the JSON for you within the request body. However, I had issues where that wouldn't happen, and so I kind of just added this in here so I can kind of get the best of both worlds and didn't have to mess around with it. And then again, I'm just building a parameter, and we're just going to then try and find the runbook. So again, getting AZ automation runbook, get parameters. It's pretty straightforward, you know, and this is basically accepting the runbook information that's passed in the body of the request. So there's no kind of internal trickery. That's all preserved within the configuration itself. So if we go back to the configuration, up in the top of the runbook PS object, again, I should just call this something better, but anyway, the name is the runbook name, and then the parameters would be the runbook parameters. And that was pretty much it. Like, it's that simple. Following that, then basically we have, oh, I think I'm in the wrong one. Did I close it? No, I didn't. Start runbook. There we go. So once we've completed that, essentially it'll then construct the runbook parameters. And this is where things got a little interesting here. This was a bug that I found within Function App, which Mark actually really, shout out to Mark. He was the gun that found it. I just couldn't work it out. And he's a bit of an Azure Functions guru under the hood. And what happened was when you had a nested hash table within a Function App, even though it's, let's say it's deserialized, it's serialized as JSON, because essentially what it did was it would convert it to be a case sensitive hash table. And so I was having issues with trying to start the runbook, and looking at it going, why is this not starting? And it was because when you had nested hash tables, it wouldn't actually convert the hash table to be case insensitive. So I had to add this in here to basically repass it to make it case insensitive. So that was the reason why we did that. And then again, start the runbook. I'm then going to set the status code. And I'm not really checking the runbook output, to be honest. There should be a whole bunch of extra code in here saying, is the runbook status, looking at, you know, waiting for the runbook to be completed, all that kind of stuff. I just honestly was not particularly, I wasn't particularly too up to that, especially when we're not writing an end-to-end solution. I'm only writing a kind of a proof of concept. And that's pretty much that. So it's pretty straightforward, and it just goes ahead and starts the runbook. Now, the one thing you're wondering is, this is a function app that's running. How do you start a runbook? You can see here there's no credentials. We're not saving any sort of credentials. And I'll quickly show you guys how I did that. Let's go quickly. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the portal. We can go have a look at the configuration of how I did that. I just clicked the wrong setting. Okay, cool. Yep, go there. Alright, so what we can do here is we're just going to go to our resource groups. And then within here you can see we can go PowerShell Summit, close that down, and let's go have a look at our PS helper. So this is the function app that we're working with. So you can see here these are the functions. It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing really that special. Let me just zoom this in. Jesus, really doesn't like being zoomed in. So let's go and have a look at the actual identity. So one thing we need to do is either give it a system identity or a user identity, a system assigned identity or a user assigned identity. to the actual function app. Now, by default, when you create a function app, they don't have identities that are associated with an Azure Active Directory. But once you actually give them, you can actually then turn on and give them an identity, and that then basically allows you to give them, assign them roles within Azure. So essentially, what I could do here is, once you see here, we've got this object ID, we just go back to resource groups. It's probably going to take me back to my parent one. Oh, this is so annoying. Yep, this always happens. I don't really want to see this. I just want you to always open new tab and keep the same tab. Anyway, so if we go back to our actual resource group here, you can then add the resource as an actual identity. So actually, no, we don't want to go to new. We just want to go IAM. So you can see here, and this is another thing that's important, is you can actually add role assignments as well. So we can give it Azure roles. If you want to go down the path and just give it some Azure roles, which is, to be honest, is a better way of doing it rather than what I did. You can see here I just gave it owner of PS Summit. We can see that. But essentially, the better way would be to give it limited access to Azure Automation to be able to actually do those bits and pieces. So again, what you want to do here is, if we want to add a new access, we can just go ahead and click Add a Role Assignment. And you can see here we've got Azure AD Group or Service Principal. So we can actually just go that, click that, and then click Function App, and it automatically is there. You can see that's my PS Helper. We can then click that, and then we can actually select what kind of role that we want to add them to. And that is it. It is that easy. So once you've done that, basically it's a system assigned. You don't need to do anything else. It's essentially, the application itself has the authority to actually all those runbooks itself. So that's pretty much that. It's not really that was probably the biggest gotcha with starting runbooks. Starting runbooks in PowerShell is way easier than doing it in C#. Now the only reason why I say that is because that's just due to a little bit of a limitation of my behalf. But at the end of the day, though, that's pretty much it. Now let's go on to the next function app. Test configuration. So the test configuration really is a bit more of a lengthy script because of the nature of how the application was working, and because it was a serverless IT self-service portal, which, for people who are not familiar with the serverless mentality, serverless basically means that you have a application that doesn't require dedicated server to be able to serve the content. In this instance, it's serverless in the sense that basically you have client JavaScript, which calls a REST API endpoint and then basically uses the data that it returns to be able to render the page. The configuration is stored locally within the JavaScript, so yes, you could modify it. However, when elements and things like that are changed or whatever, and you want to actually send it back, this is the code here which will validate your request. So essentially what it will do is it will reload the configuration knowing it's a good configuration, and then validate your configuration that you sent back to ensure that your configuration is indeed correct as well. So it's a pretty, this is quite a lengthy script, so I'm going to kind of go through all the kind of ins and outs that I validated. There's a thousand things you can validate here, but to be honest, again, I'm just kind of writing the bare minimum for a proof of concept. But it basically allows you to add that, essentially add the essential security to your server app without having to do any sort of crazy code that requires it. So again, I just use the PowerShell helper to do that. So we've got our parameters, so fairly standard. We're going to deserialize our JSON, so again, that's pretty standard. And that you can see here, we're going to load our DLL, so we need the configuration builder because we need to load the configuration and as a type. So we're going to go ahead and build that. And we're basically going to assume that the response is correct. So this function itself is implicitly true, and then it will be looking for explicit reasons to say false. So that's what it's doing here. So we're basically setting our status and our response body already to be implicitly true, and then from what we find will then be implicitly false. Anyway, so we build the configuration, we send that back. You can see here, go through, it's exactly the same code as a get configuration. To be honest, we could have just called get configuration, that would probably be a better use. However, in this instance, we're just going to, I've just added it in there for the sake of it. Now, the first thing we're going to be doing is validating the body of the request. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looking for essentially all these properties. Do the properties exist? So we're looking for the identity property, the type property, the HTML name selected, the HTTP response body parameters. So now you can see this is a little bit different to what it's sending back. And the reason why is because what the endpoint receives from the C# application is the identity of the actual person who's sending the request. So will capture the identity from the token, the type of the request, and then basically the response information that it requires to be able to achieve its task. So that's the first thing it's going to do. It's going to validate, is my data there? Is there something there? The next thing that it's going to do is it's going to match type. So it's going to basically ensure that everything that is there is current and it's the correct type. So we're just basically looking at, match the type, sorry. No, that's not true, forget that. What it's doing here is it's matching the type of the configuration to the type, the request body type. So it's ensuring that the type that was passed in here matches the type in the request body. That's important because basically, again, that could be tampered with, and there could be things that could happen there. I can't remember exactly what the ins and outs is with this because it's been so long. To be honest, I should have done this talk a little earlier, but I just didn't have the time. So in here you can see, well, let's have a bit of a look. Let's try and work out what type is. We got HTTP content type and then request body. What's request body? Let's actually have a look for it. Okay, we've got response body. That's request body. I'm actually intrigued now because it'll okay, so it's just the body. Okay, so what it's looking at here, you got added configuration, HTTP content type. What it's looking at here is if we go and have a look at the configurations, it's matching the type. Was it REST body type? Yeah, I think it was REST body type. I'm just going to open that up. And then I'm going to reopen this up. Yeah, it's HTTP content. Okay, yeah. So it's looking at the HTTP content type from the configuration. So this type, these just, again, this is a fault on my behalf, but ultimately these types are the same. They have to be the same. That's just a configuration design flaw that I kind of came across, and I was like, I can't be bothered. I'll just put it like that for the time being. But essentially, these are the same. And so what happens here, you have this type, which is add user to distribution group. So it's matching to make sure all the types within the configuration is the type that is actually here. So are they sending something that they shouldn't? This is important because we need the type to be able to re-identify. The type is used as a unique identifier to the configuration itself. So before we can even do that, we need to make sure that the type is actually correct here. That's why this exists. Now, once we know the configuration, so essentially we're just doing a configuration match, we can validate the run parameters are valid. So think of it as if this is the type, we know that this add user to distribution group is the type that it is. And the reason why is because type is unique for each configuration element. So if we go and have a look at this, you can see it's different. So these are uniquely different for each configuration. That's why it's doing it. It needs to be able to identify which configuration type or which configuration file it needs to use to be able to actually validate. So now it's matched the configuration. We're going to then validate the runbook parameters as valid. So what we're going to do here is essentially a two-way compare back and forth. We're going to go through each of the configuration item within the automation runbook and look at the parameters and make sure we can match them to the parameters within the request. And then vice versa, we're going to flip it and look at the other side. And the reason why we do that is because we need to ensure that if there's anything that basically is not like anything extra outside the two, it needs to be picked up. So that's why I flipped the two. You basically invert them, you invert the logic on each other. So once we've completed that, we can now go ahead and then match the data that we're actually sending. So this is really the kind of the crux of the script. And so what it's doing is it looks at each of the parameters and then it makes sure it then basically matches that parameter to the HTML configuration item. And what I mean by that is, so for example, if you've got a match parameter name up here, so let's go have a look at the runbook. We have a parameter, we have a name, and then we have a HTML name. The HTML name corresponds to the HTML name here. So what we're doing is essentially we're going, okay, these are our parameters, and these are the parameters within the configuration. So we have that data now. We can then match that HTML name to the HTML configuration item. So you can see here we match the parameter name, so that's what we're doing there, and then we're going to get that configuration item. So again, it's just, you know, a bit of a where object that can do that. It's pretty straightforward. And then what we have is tag is null, then throw an error. So again, if there's an issue with the configuration not meeting, if anything is null there, basically that means that nothing exists within the element type. So element type is a property, select or input. If it's null, there's a problem. We need to basically return an error. It also looks at if it's an element type is not equal to a select, then we'll also skip it. Now that adds a bit of a security risk there, because ultimately someone could potentially add a password reset script, and you could essentially put items within that password reset script. You could essentially rewrite whatever you want in that. You could reset anyone's password if you chose to, because there's no way to validate what is approved there from the configuration. Moving forward, what you could potentially do would be to actually have approved users, or you could tightly couple those kinds of functionality together. So essentially, if you have a password reset script, you could have a configuration item underneath that basically saying approved values. And then within that, you basically, like you could have like predefined variables that could be set. So for instance, you could have like, you know, like $current user in the hash table. And then that would basically associate to the configuration, but basically saying it needs to be the current identity. So then when we're validating the configuration, ultimately those kinds of things, you could basically say, okay, what kind of endpoint is this? You know, okay, yep, this is a type text box. Oh, sorry, what type of element is this? This is a type text box. Okay, we then need to we have a validation on the actual entry, so we can look at the entry and its current user. So that, okay, if it gets current user, we can actually then just call. We could actually just even have a rule that is defined within the configuration that the person could actually write custom code for, which essentially could validate that rule. So it would go, okay, you know, if custom is, you know, like element.text is equal to identity, and essentially it'd just be it, and that it essentially would just be a true or false condition. That's all it would need to do. And then so essentially what would happen here is we would just basically look at the configuration and go, okay, is there any sort of post configuration that would be needed? And then within that post configuration, we could then go ahead and then fix that up. So that's really it. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Following that, you have so I'm just going through here. Okay, so following all that, now we're going to do a lookup of the value, ensure that the value. So now this is now working with the select. So think of it as you've got a drop-down box. What we're looking for here is any sort of value that is in the select drop-down box that is outside the configuration spec. So the configuration always has a list of what is included in the drop-down box, as you can see here, values. And what we're going to do is look at the actual submitted value and see if it's actually included in this. If it's not, we know that someone's being it's basically messing with the JSON. Okay, cool. And that will then go ahead and invalidate the request here. So you can see here essentially what we're doing is HTML configuration values not contains parameter value. If it's not in there, it doesn't exist. That's straightforward. It's case insensitive, so it doesn't have to be. So there's not going to be issues with that. The only thing that potentially would be an issue would be is if there was white spacing or anything like that involved. However, through testing, I have never seen that have an issue. So, excuse me, sorry. So in this instance, it's malformed. So even if you add a white space to the end of that specific select, it'll invalidate the request because it doesn't match what's within the requirements. Finally, we then basically, if it all fails, it'll then obviously any time it will fail, it'll just throw a terminating error, which will obviously get caught, and then basically invalidate the request. And that's it. That's how we validate our code. So it's pretty straightforward that way. The next thing is, actually no, that's pretty much it. That's our helper. So that's all our helper in 40 minutes, which is, actually no, I wouldn't say 40 minutes. I would say what? When did we start streaming? We started about 6. So yeah, 40 minutes. So one talk just on a walkthrough. But essentially that's the helper. So the helper is really just, yeah, like I said, it's just the REST API function app that pretty much runs whatever. We can see that configuration within here. So the next thing let's have a bit of a look at is API management. API management is always a good thing to understand before we go into the durable function, to kind of have a bit of an understanding how everything hangs together. Now, this is a bad way of kind of explaining the layout, because ultimately API management proxies everything through it. So all REST requests go through Azure API management for validation. So it's not, there's no direct calls between any sort of function app. It's all being proxied through API management. So let's go have a look at that. So let's go have a look at that. Azure API management. This is a super basic implementation of it, but it'll still help articulate what's happening. So you can see how here we have our 3 APIs. These are the 3 APIs here. So 1, 2, 3. This little event smaller function essentially is part of the durable function. So when you see this, I want you to kind of think of it as the same, because it is an externally callable durable function. That's just, it's a separate URL that this endpoint can call, but essentially they're the same. So what we can do here is let's go have a look at that endpoint. So you can see here we have the automation task. So let's have a look at the helper first, because that's what we'll be working with. So you can see here, everything is getting passed through. I don't know why there's an options there. I might have accidentally added an options. But if we look at our policies and things like that, there's no real policies in place. The only thing that's really kind of providing any sort of security for this instance, and to be honest, this would be better, like these function apps would be better called using Event Grid than they would be using APIs, to be honest. It's just a better way of doing it, but I'm just doing it for the sake of I needed to write an end-to-end solution from within. I need to write a talk and build a solution in 2 months, so I just went with what was quickest. But if I was doing this in the future, to be honest, the function app and the logic app would not be using REST. They would just be using Event Grid to communicate with each other. Anywho, so the way that it adds some sense of security is just basically using subscriptions. So with you to be able to actually make a request, you need to have an actual subscription within the header. Otherwise, it'll just invalidate it. So ultimately, that's really how it's kind of holding it all together. Not the best way, but for a solution that I quickly needed to spin up, it's not too bad. Whoops. Let's go back here. So the next one we have here is we have our logic app. So you can see in here, I've actually brought in our logic app. I'm not using Flow / Power Automate. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm not really particularly big fan with logic app, but again, I got caught for time. So I needed to be able to do a Teams approval process quickly, and Logic App was able to provide that. So what we can do here is within here, you can see here, we've just got a manual invoke. It's not really that special. This basically is just the endpoint that it needs to hit to be able to actually call the Logic App. You can see it's got a rewrite URI on that. So it's just essentially rewriting the URI. A lot of this is out of the box. So when I added this, it's that easy. And to be honest, I'll show you how easy it is to actually add a function app. Let's go ahead and add an API. Literally go there, click function app, browse to your function app. We can actually add the hot copy user sentiment. Click that. And that's it. Like if I click create, it'll then add it there. It'll automatically create my calls policies, things like that. It's that easy. Honestly, API management, it's really easy to use. It gets a little tricky when you're writing calls policies, but really out of the box is perfectly fine. I don't really see any sort of, it wasn't that much of a learning curve compared to other technologies that I've used. Let's go have a look at the other ones. So essentially the only real one that has a valid calls policies is the automation task. So this is pretty much the production endpoint. You can see here it has there's three operations that you can perform. We've got the get, which if we remembered from our workflow, let's go back to our workflow here. Our get is essentially after we've obtained our token, it'll then it'll then call initialize, and essentially that's our get request, which is initialize. So if we go here, you can see there's our initialize endpoint. That's basically going to tell the API endpoint, hey, I want to log in, and here's my token data, and I wish to have the configuration so I can actually render it on my portal. Now the response, it'll respond with the configuration, never going to give you up. No, that's just a bit of a joke. It's going to respond with the configuration, and then once we're ready to make an input, we can then just call invoke HTTP start. And this basically then will, when you want to make a request, it will then trigger that. Now you're wondering what that other one was. You've got which was invoke HTTP start. Once it decides to start loading again. If you guys want to ask questions, don't be afraid to ask some questions. It's always good. So invoke request HTTP start within HTTP start. So it basically just passes it through. Now we'll have a quick look at the calls policy. One thing that's really important to understand with serverless code in JavaScript is that when the browsers have introduced a new, well, I was going to say it's new, it's semi-new technology called cross-origin resource scripting. So essentially, it was really kind of implemented to kind of add an extra layer of security to JavaScript execution within the browser itself. So what would happen is if you wanted to add a script, let's say, you know, to do something, you wanted to call something, the browser would actually, the website that you were calling it from would need to basically, the web server that you were calling it from needed to basically provide a list of domains that were allowed for JavaScript to be let's say called from, JavaScript to execute from, also to run requests from and to. So essentially, if you have JavaScript that's doing a HTTP query, or any, I shouldn't say HTTP query, a REST query, anything like that, it would actually block the request and it will invalidate the request. So you basically need to overwrite those kinds of configurations. I won't say overwrite, but essentially you need to ensure those configurations are those endpoints that you're trying to access. So if there's if you've got sitting on, let's say you've got a domain called blah.com, you've got an API service there that you're trying to call, you need to make sure that that web service that you're hosting it on basically adds that as an accepted domain for your REST request. All of the browser won't actually run it. It's quite a pain, but it is what it is. It's actually quite a useful thing because it protects against bad things. And as you can see here, there's not really much in the way of terms of policies. I thought I had a calls policy in here. Oh, it might be it's an all operation policy. So you can see here within the calls policies, I'm just basically allowing the origin. So the origin, that's what I'm talking about. So what domains are allowed. So I'm just saying, yeah, mate, everything's allowed. To be honest, this would be better suited to actually lock down to a specific domain. So your web services domain. And then you allow the methods. So I've just basically gone, okay, I'm using get, I'm using post, and I'm using options. Now, options is basically not really used by my API. So you could probably remove that. Only get post is really needed. Options is actually included out of the box with API management. And one of the things, actually, just to quickly sidestep back for a moment, when you do a HTTP request or a HTTP REST request within the browser, what it will actually do is it will initially send an options request to say, hey, are you valid? Here's what data do you have, blah, blah, blah. And so what happens here is when you've got your post and your options, so it will send an options method to API management, and API management will automatically handle that for you and will respond back saying, yes, I'm valid, and then go ahead and issue me a request, and it will go ahead and issue a request. So that's really, when you see options being sent, that's what's happening. And then we're going to expose some headers. So we also need to expose some additional headers. So I'm expecting the content type, the authorization, and the access control allow origins headers. Now this header here is what essentially is the allowed origins. So this says, hey, I'm allowing these kinds of things. And the reason why I'm allowing this is just because, actually there's no real reason. You don't really need to use that. You only really need to use content type and authorization. All right. So once we've got that, what we can do is have a bit of a look at Teams approve. Actually, no, we've already looked at that. And you can see in here, we had this third one. So you could see we had initialize, and then we had invoke HTTP request start. Invoke request HTTP start, which is basically responsible for starting the automation process. And then we have invoke approval response. That's this. So if we go back to our configuration, that's this one here. So that REST request is used by our endpoint, our logic app, to actually trigger our durable function. So here we have an event which basically raises an approval response, whether it's a yes or whether it's a no. It just passes it through. And that's pretty much that. So it's pretty straightforward. All right, let's take this off because it's getting a little warm now. All right, so the next thing we have is let's carry on. So we've covered our helper, we've covered API management, so we know how it all kind of talks to each other. We've talked about that. Let's go have a look at the logic app. Again, logic app's not the best way of doing this. I probably will rewrite this into an actual app itself rather than using logic app, because it's just easier. And essentially the logic app is really straightforward. So it's just got a HTTP endpoint that we're looking at. So again, and then, okay, it's obviously everything's expired because I haven't actually used this for over a couple of months. So we need to refresh our certificates. But essentially it'll post a response to, it'll post a option as the Flowbot to a user. So it'll say, hey, you want to be able to log in with this? Yep, sure, go ahead. And then basically what happens there, it'll capture that. Now you can see that in the video, so we can actually just go ahead and have a quick look at that in the video. So let's have a quick look here. Oh, it's decided that for some reason it's opening it on the other screen. So let me just quickly see if I can get this to come across. All right, perfect. Let's do that. So you can see in here, so everyone can have a bit of a look. That's basically there. So you can see I've just got two options in there. I've got an approve and a deny. The recipient, the owner. The recipient is the owner, and the owner will just be would actually be an email address, to the tenant. And then the message, and then is it an alert? Yes, make an alert. And that's really it. And then basically what it does is it literally just composes the JSON response, which is instance ID. Now the instance ID is the instance ID of the durable function. So when you create a new durable function process, it'll create an instance ID, and that instance ID basically is what's used to send it events and receive things. So essentially, here's the instance ID. So this is the thing that we need to change. And this is the selected option. Is it a yes or is it a no? And then as you can see down the bottom there, it's a HTTP post it back to the URL response. That's also included in the request. So when the request was initially sent, it would contain, we can actually have a look at the schema. Is it going to let me have a look at the schema? Yes. You can see there's the instance, there's the message, there's the owner, there's the URL response. So everything's contained in the request itself. It's just going to say, here you go. And yeah, it makes it a lot easier in terms of things, because then basically this is essentially self-contained, and it don't have to worry about anything with it. So the only thing we need to make sure is that the data that's being passed in is correct. And that's pretty much that when it comes to the logic app. So we've now covered our helper, our logic app, API management, and now we're going to have a bit of a look at our durable function. So durable function was written in C#. And this is version 1, I believe. It's been a while since I've looked at this. So we're going to play a bit of, we're going to have a bit of a look at have a look at it and see where we're at. Okay, cool. All right, I think it's this line. Yes, is it? No, I don't think it's this one. Is it? Actually, no, yes, sorry, it is. Okay, so the first thing we obviously need to remember is that we have a whole bunch of classes in here, and we also added our DLL. So our DLL should be added as a reference. Well, where's my references? Dependencies, assemblies. So you can see here that configuration for DLL that we added it as a reference to our to our actual main app itself. So that's what was done here. And then outside of that, what we can do now is we can go to we'll go into these later, but essentially we can just kind of go through the normal process. So the first part of the process is if we go back to our slide deck, we can look at the client workflow. The first thing it does after it gets a token is it needs to initialize. So this is where the configuration gets returned to the client app. So we can have a bit of a look at that. This is we don't need to look at that anymore. So this is the initialize. So again, it's just this generic. Man, I'm looking at. Yep, this is the one. Yeah. So it's a HTTP. It's just a standard function. There's nothing really going on in here. The only thing that's really important to make note is that you can see in here, the first thing that we're doing is we're validating our token. So that token that was obtained, we need to make sure that that token is valid. So you can see here, we've obviously processed the request. We're going to basically call our claims principal, and we're just going to validate our token. Make sure that it is correct, and then if it's great, we are then going to I'm just having a memory blank here. I'm like, cool. Return the configuration to the user. That should have called. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of a memory. Ah, never mind. Don't worry about me. I got myself muddled up a little bit. I was thinking that it needed to actually call another function, but it didn't. This only needs to return the configuration that is basically the configuration that is needed by the client. It doesn't need to do anything else. So the requirements here is start, validate the claim, return the configuration. That's it. So let's go have a look at our configuration here. So let's go and have a look in here. So you can see here we have, actually I'm just going to close that one down and we're just going to go have a look at the class itself. So essentially what's happening here is we've got a claims principal that's generic. It's just the, we create a generic claims principal. And then we're going to basically call this method here, which is validate token async. And so you can see here we have our we have essentially a class. This class actually borrowed of a gentleman on the internet. It was very saved me a lot of work to do it. But essentially what happens here is we have our claims principal. We call this method, and then essentially, firstly, again, it looks at, validates to make sure the token schema is a type bearer. We don't want basic, we don't want whatever else, so it needs to be a bearer token. We're going to obviously configure our cancellation. I wouldn't want to configure a cancellation token, but what we're going to need to do is get a configuration. So here I'm just going to get my configuration. And then basically we're going to get the token issuer, the token audience. And what we're going to do then is build out our parameters. Once we've built out the parameters, and we give it a couple of tries, we're then going to basically validate that token. So essentially pass the parameter, and then if it's all great, good and dandy, we will return a token. Ultimately, we're just interested in actually, is it working? So we're not particularly interested in the token. From what I remember, this has been a while since I've looked at this. I might need to, you see I had breakpoints there. This class essentially is just very static. It's just a static class. You can see here, up at the top here, we have the environmental variable, which is a token issuer. So we have our token issuers added to our configuration within our function app. And then basically we add our document retriever and then our configuration manager. So this is basically essentially calls the creates the configuration management. That's pretty much it for the security. It's pretty basic, but it's also like I have to go hook a debugger back onto it because I can't, like, honestly, I haven't looked at it for a couple of months, so I'm a little, yeah, that's not as fresh as what it should have been. Anyway, so that's essentially the initialize. Now actually no, I haven't gone this part. So now we're going to return our HTML configuration. So let's go have a look at this class here. We can see in here we have again a static class. I've got a list of HTML object, and then I have a HTML object serialized. So it essentially creates a string that's got the serialized context of that. The content of that, to be honest, it could just be a method, but anyway. And then what happens here is obviously we've got our a static class to serialization. I think I fixed that. And so in here we have our configuration with our result. Basically, we're just going to deserialize the configuration and then basically set the configuration to that. So ultimately, serialization, that's the current config. HTML config serialize, yeah, and then it's just going to pass that. Actually, I don't think it needs to do that. I think it needs to actually pass that. I think there's a bug right there. That's why that's actually not correct. The next thing it does, obviously, we have get config. So in here, this is obviously get config. It then just fires off a REST request to our get configuration PowerShell helper. So if we remember, if we go back to our PowerShell helper, it fires the get request to this and basically says, I want you to build me the configuration. And once it does that, then it will, actually no, that works because it deserializes it. And you can see here, it's actually deserializing it as the specific object type that we actually created within that DLL. So you can see that, and then it sets the deserialize object. Oh, actually, no, that's correct. Sorry, no, that is 100% correct. So this property basically is the serialized version. This is the deserialized version. I just got confused. So this is a serialized version of the configuration. So it's actually an object where this is actually, sorry, no, it's the other way around. This is actual just plain text, obviously because it's type string, and then this is basically just the deserialized version. So you can see here, get the result. It's obviously going to be a result type string. I'm not doing anything in here. I'm just basically reading the result, returning it. So it's obviously returning a task. It's returning a task string. And then basically here, what I'm doing is I'm basically just saying, okay, yep, that's fine. Set that as a normal. Set the configuration, which is type text, to that property, which is fine, and then set that to that, and that's it. That makes a lot more sense now. It's been a while. Like, it is honestly been a while. All right, and that is pretty much how the configuration is returned. It's just going to go fire request off, get me the configuration. Here you go, good to go. Once that's completed, what time of day is it? Ooh. Once that's completed, the next thing that it does is, if we go back to this, the PowerPoint, is it will now, we've got the configuration, we've rendered it. We're going to talk about rendering and all that stuff on the client side, but essentially what it will do here is the user's filled out the data, and now we're going to send that to the actual server saying, hey, we want you to do a specific action. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we can do here is it's going to call the HTTP start. So let's go and find that. This is always a fun one. Start runbook. No, it's not start runbook. Invoke request. No, where is it? It was down the bottom somewhere. Yeah, okay, yeah, no, it was invoke request. So you can see here, when you create a function That's a durable function. It also adds a durable orchestration client starter, and this basically instructs the function app that, hey, I'm a durable function app, and I'm going to need a little bit more data. So essentially what it'll do here is it'll create instance IDs and things like that for you. So yeah, and you can see it's type post. It's just a function authorization level, and then we've got our HTTP request message. So within our HTTP request message, we have our authentication validation. So we've got claims. Again, we've gone through the same thing before. It's validating it. Now, the first thing you see here is we're basically reading the JSON. So we're basically, you can see here, reading the string asynchronously. What is in the body of our content? Or what's our content? Or what's our body of our request? If it's null or empty, don't send me nothing. That's really what it does. And then once it's completed that, I'm just going to log the JSON body because I was testing stuff. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just basically dynamically deserialize it, because I actually need to tack some data onto this before I send it into onto my actual orchestrator, onto my actual durable function itself. So this is this is the HTTP side of it, and you're going to see there's going to be another side of it. And the reason why we do that, the reason why I need to do that is because we need to actually get the principal and the identity. So I need to know who's sending this, because that's the data that we need to be able to pass that on to. Remember, if we go to the approval process had a identity component to it. So essentially the identity is what's used. Hey, this person wants to do this action. Do you want to say yes or no? So that's what we're doing there. So we're going to capture the identity. Once it's done that, then I'll reserialize it all back in, and then call our starter. So this is where it's going to actually start the runbook. So I always say runbook. It's going to start the orchestration of that specific, of the invoke request orchestration. Now the other thing here, you can see it started it, and it's going to return the instance ID of the user. The instance ID is basically used to check the status. It's obviously, like I talked about before, you can use it to basically raise events and all that kind of jazz. And then basically it'll return a HTTP status code OK. So it's not going to wait. It's basically going to say, yep, I've started, and you can query the endpoint. So it'll actually return a HTTP status OK, and then if you actually if you look at the response, it'll give you a query URI, and you can query that URI, and it'll tell you what the job is actually doing at that point in time. So it's quite handy to use. And it's just using that specific instance ID. That's how it's keeping track of everything. So once it's completed that, it's going to go ahead and invoke our starter. So let's go have a look at that. So I'm just going to minimize this so I don't get confused. You can see here, this is our actual orchestration here. So you can see here, we're passing through our orchestration context and our item. Now, the one thing that's really important I found here, and I haven't really worked out a way around it, so someone might be able to, out there might be able to help out with this, is that the orchestration context is can only accept one type of data. So essentially that's the reason why I'm tacking on the principal onto the request before I'm passing it through. I tried adding different object types, so literally having a common class where I could just pass, that actual JSON request with the actual, I think, grab the identity, but it seems that it only likes to have it basically only likes passing serialized JSON around. So that's one of the observations I know, and that's hence the reason why I've tacked it onto the request, and then basically you can see here now we're deserializing it again. So essentially here we've basically, this is really stock standard kind of durable function. What we've got here is we're going to deserialize our JSON, and we're going to deserialize it into our HTTP response body. So let's go have a look at that class. And you can see here we have the identity, the type, and the HTML name selected. So when the user sends the response back, these are the things that it's sending. So it doesn't send the full configuration back. What it sends back is the type, so the configuration. So if we remember, if we go back to configurations, we have the type, and then basically it's going to send the HTML name selected. So this is the item that it needs to do what it needs to do. It's not the best way of doing it, to be honest, because you could potentially have multiple things. So if you had a new user starting, you had a little new user form, there'll be multiple forms that it needs to be able to send back. So again, this was just kind of slapped together and in a little bit of a rush to kind of get that sorted, but the functionality remains the same there. So essentially what you would have there is just this, you would have a class that basically would just be a dynamic class that would contain those items. It'd be pretty straightforward. So then you have your HTML response body, and then we have get request items. So again, so what this does, before we do that, let's quickly check to see if it's actually calling that method. No, it's just deserializing it. Yeah. So right at this point in time, it hasn't actually gone through HTML response body. I just want to make sure, see what it's doing. Yeah, it's just deserialized it. So it hasn't actually called get request item. Does it actually get called when it gets called? When does it get called? Line 28. Line 28 in Teams approval. Oh, okay. So that's a team's approval thing. Okay, that's fine. Not the best place to put it, but anyway. So what happens here is it's going to deserialize it, and then it's going to create a Teams approval card. So I've got this custom class here, which again, remember how the Teams approval logic app. So if we go back to that video, and we can just have a look at the schema directly. I think we can still look at the schema. Essentially, we have a custom class that's been sent. So we've got the instance ID, the message, the owner, the URL response. So that class is responsible for creating this. So if we go to here, you can see here, requested item, instance ID, message, owners. So in here, instance ID, message, URL response, owners, owner. That's actually interesting, that one there. That caused a lot of issues with Teams where because it's expecting a type string, it kind of had issues with that. So I just worked around it. Oh, excuse me. I'm very tired. So essentially, it's going to create a new Teams approval. So if we go back to, I'm just going to keep this open. And if we go back to close him down, we're creating a new object and then basically just passing in those items. So if we go in here, actually, where is it? We're just calling this specific constructor here. So you can see here, basically get request item. So we're just calling this method here. So let's go have a look at this method. Okay, and so what this does, this basically, so I'm just looking at this, trying to work out how this worked. Where is it? Response body, get request item. Okay. I'm like, am I supposed to be passing stuff? But then I realized it's within the object. So essentially what it's doing here is it's looking at the type and all that, and it's going to have a look at the configuration. And within the configuration, it's then going to be able to actually construct to say, hey, oh, it's not construct, it's actually doing a quick check and it's going, hey, is the type there? Is the type you need? So in here, we're just basically saying, all right, just doing a bit of link. It's looking for a the HTML name to HTML name selected. Oh, sorry, firstly to HTML content type to type. Does the type exist? And does the HTML name selected exist as well? Once it has those items, what's it doing here? HTML single default, p.name, parameter name. Okay, it's looking at the parameter name as well. And if it's happy, it'll then just return the parameter name is equal to parameter name dot value. HTTP response parameters, p.name. Just trying to work out where this one is. I'll have a quick look. HTTP response parameters. Okay, so yeah, it's basically looking here. This is a custom class that man, it's been so long since I've done this. Let's quickly jump back. I'm just going to quickly step back out and then we can go back in again. So we're basically teams approval. Go ahead, create an approval, get the owners. And get owners is, yeah, you can see there, just get the owners. It's pretty straightforward. That's just a link query that's looking at that, but we need to get the request item. Okay, yep, so we're getting the request item, perform a lookup, correct parameter name, matches HTML name selected. So once it has that content, then it's using the parameter name. Oh, okay, so it's just testing the actual parameters to make sure that they're valid as well. That's why it's doing this. So that, yeah, again, I haven't looked at this in ages. So, and also I should have actually wrote some better comments. You can see here there's a convert to JSON, so it's just stringifying. It's just serializing the serializing this HTTP response. Anyway, so once it's done that, it's created a team's approval card. You can see here it's created our card. We can then go ahead and actually test our configuration. So within our test configuration, that was that. It's going to call that separate function app, that PowerShell function app that we called. So, and you can see here what we're doing is we're just calling the activity asynchronously, and we're just going to wait for it. So essentially we're saying, hey, I want you to go run this activity. Here's the body that we basically need to test. So this is actually using the Teams card. That makes a little bit more sense. And make sure that it's correct. So this is actually fobbing off that specific job. So we can actually have a look at test configuration. So let's go have a look at that. So test configuration is you can see it's super basic. Essentially all it contains is it's just a REST request to this. So not to that, that is not it, it's to this. And it'll just call that and pass the data into our request, and that's all it's doing. So it's not really doing any sort of crazy, it's not doing any sort of crazy things here. It's just basically just fobbing off the request to our PowerShell helper. Now you can see here we're passing a subscription key in, and we're basically just using environmental. We're using the environmental variable. When you want to query configuration items within the function app, so we'll quickly jump into the function app. You can do that using, it's not the helper, it's going to be, you can use that, you can do that by using the environmental variables. So it'll actually load those configuration items as environmental variables. Configurations are stored under your function app. And if you go to, where is it? Config. Honestly, I just keep forgetting what it was. No, this is, sorry, wrong one. That's actually an automation account. Sorry. They're too deceptively similar. Yeah, so if you go into the configuration under settings, you can see here, within here, I have all the configuration in here. So it'll just pull this, the values stored in here. So you can keep, so if you need to update the URL endpoints or anything like that, you're not updating it in the code, you can just update it in the configuration. That's pretty much it. That's what it's doing here. And then following that, it's basically just posting a request. It's waiting for that request. So we're just going to post, await it, and then once it's completed, then just respond whether it's true or false. So if there's a success code, yes, it's true. If it's false, if there was a 400, 500s, anything like that, it will then say that the configuration is invalid, and it will then invalidate. So once we've done that, it'll then, obviously, if the result's bad, if it's false, it'll then just stop the function. So it's going to call this terminate stop function method, which essentially is a, it'll log the error. It was going to do some other bits and pieces, but that's really all it does. And it should quit, but there's a bug there and it doesn't. So it actually, if the configuration fails, it actually carries on where it should, but to be honest, you should probably put a return there to stop that, and then you probably put a return false there like this. And then I need to wrap that inside of an actual logic block. So you need to do something like that to basically to invalidate it. So that's pretty much that. So it's now valid. The next thing we need to do is send a request to Teams for approval. So within, we have the context. The context is basically just an object that is used with to be able to actually interact with the actual Drupal function itself. And there's a method in there which you can use, which is called set custom status, where you can actually add custom statuses to the Drupal function. And that's really good because if you have a process or a dashboard, you know, if you've got your own Drupal function and it's doing a user provisioning and something like that, you could actually query it and you could see that it was waiting for approval. So if you've got a help desk that gets called up and it goes, why is this not working? From a client, you know, I put it in my IT self-service app, you can then basically hit the URL endpoint, and then from that you can see, hey, it's waiting for approval. It might be a little while. And that's pretty much that. Like, it's really quite cool. Once it's done that, it's then going to send our approval request. So again, it's going to be triggering our Teams. This is again very similar code to the test configuration. So we're going to have a look at that. So this is going to call an activity function, a Drupal function. So let's go have a look at that. Teams approval. Where's Teams approval? Okay. You got a request and we have a response, and we'll talk about that in a sec. So now we've got our Teams approval. It's going to basically call the Teams approval request. That's interesting. Why did it? Yeah, so it's creating it. So Microsoft Teams approval, invoke Teams request. So it's passing in this. It's expecting this response type, and then we're just going to pass in this request. And then what we're passing in is our Teams approval card, which is that card that we created earlier up here. We know it's valid, so we're happy to actually send the approval. You can see in here we've got not that one, this one here. You can see here this is just an activity. We have our approval card that we're expecting as our type, and then basically what we're doing in here is getting our environmental variables, creating a HTTP request, and then posting the request, and that's it. We're not doing anything else with it. It's pretty, yeah, it's pretty basic. Once we've completed that, we're now going to wait for a response. And so what we're doing is now we're going to call our context, and we're going to call these two methods here, and we're going to wait for these two events. But that doesn't actually tell the code to stop processing. We actually need to create, we're just creating an instance essentially an event to be able to actually wait for. So what we do then is basically we create a response. So then basically what we're doing here is we're waiting for when any of these events are raised, then we can actually carry on. So right now then the code will actually pause and wait until this approval has been raised. And so what will happen is obviously it will trigger that logic app. The user will click yes. It's got that response URL, so it'll basically pass that back in. Fantastic. And what that response is this endpoint here. So it's going to call that HTTP approval response. So if we remember going back to our API management, it'll call, where is it? API, no, it's not API connection, API management service. It's going to call this API endpoint. Wait for it to load. Automation task. It's going to call that HTTP approval response back. So once it's called that, this is what will get triggered. It'll trigger this HTTP. Now, this HTTP function. Now, what's actually interesting here is that you can see that it still has the orchestration client. And what we're actually doing is we still need this. We still need the orchestrated client because we actually need to raise an event. So it's still, technically, it's still part of the actual orchestration. Technically it's part of the orchestration function app, but it's kind of disjointed off to the side. So it's only, like, it's connected, but it's not really connected. That's hence the reason why when we look at that breakdown, it's kind of just it's kind of hanging off to the side there. Anyway, so what's going to happen here is obviously it's going to read the body of the request. It's going to deserialize it. It's basically going to assume that there's an instance ID in a selected option. If there's not, it's then basically essentially, also if they're both not null and everything's okay, then it'll actually send it. It'll send the approval status through. So there's no approve or deny. It just passes it straight through. And then if it doesn't, it raises a bad request. So if it raises a bad request, nothing gets done on the endpoint side. Oh, sorry, on the durable function side. It'll just still be waiting, and it'll wait indefinitely. In this instance, the event worked. We've got an approve, and you can see what will happen is that event gets raised, and then this process will then continue on. Once that's completed, it then needs to work out, we've just set a custom status that actually, to be honest, could be moved down, but anyway, it then is going to validate the response. Is it a deny event or is it an approval event? If it's a deny event, oh well, request denied, return false. I'm specifying a false here because ultimately there was a bug in the, I'll say a bug, or there's a, the durable functions always require a type to be returned, whether it's a string, whether it's an integer, whether it's a bool, whether it's a class. It needs something to return. If it doesn't have anything to return, you just say task void. The eventing within the durable function won't work properly. It'll actually hang. You will raise the event. It looks like it's raised it, and it just won't carry on. And the reason why is because it doesn't know has the durable function closed? Is it not closed? So you actually need to have a type to be able to actually do that. To be able to make sure that it has something to work with. Once that's completed, we can then go down and get our configuration. So we're just pulling our configuration. Again, we saw that in the initialize. It's just a class, a static class. We're just pulling that. Now, one really cool thing about this is that because it will cache it after the first run. So if you call the configuration after the first initialize or whatever, the configuration is then cached within C#. So what that means is that you're not doing excessive API querying. You basically just called it once. Here's the configuration. I've cached it. We don't need to do it anymore. That's actually one of the really powerful things about that. It also raises an issue where basically there's once the function app, the only real way to refresh the configuration is to restart the function app. So that's something that obviously there's a bug there. So if you make a configuration change or something like that, it won't actually propagate until you restart both function apps. Excuse me. All right. So once that's completed, you then have I'm just trying to work what's going on here. Okay, now what we're basically going to be doing is ensuring that use link to join the type to the type within the configuration. Okay, so it's basically just joining the HTTP content type to the response body type. So we're basically matching the two within the configuration, which is all good. If it can't match it, or there's multiple, highly unlikely, because that's what the actual testing should have done. But if it did, then there's a problem. Once that's all done, then we're basically going to build an automation runbook job. So this again is just a custom class. Is it? No, it's not. This is actually actually no, it's a custom class. It's a custom class. We can have a look at it. You can see here, it's just a generic class. You've got a name, you've got some parameters. You see it's passed as an iDictionary. Rundown, resource group name, automation account name. So it's super basic. So go ahead, create me that, and what it's doing here is essentially it's creating all the account name, the resource group name from the environmental variables, because that's all stored in there. Then basically adding the runbook name from the configuration, and then creating the parameters as just a generic dictionary at this point in time. Then what it will do here is it'll actually associate the configuration name. So it'll actually create the runbook name and then the actual HTML value that you imported. So if you put, you click the drop down box and selected blah, 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 it'll add blah, blah, blah as the value. So it's just found the actual configuration value and it's then added that. Once it's completed that, we can call the runbook. Just got to retry options. I don't think we actually needed this. This was some legacy code. And then from that, basically, we're going to then call activity with retry. Oh, no, we did use it. That's cool. So if it fails, it'll actually try a few times, and then it'll give it a go. That's cool. I totally forgot out of that. So again, we're going to call the start runbook. And again, this is going to call the helper. So it's actually just going to fob off a REST request to the helper to actually do that. And you can see here, we're going to pull the URL from the environmental variables. We're going to serialize our parameters, which is just that specific class. Once we've done that, you can see here, it's just a generic HTTP request. Obviously, put some headers in there, post the request. That's it. There's not really much else to do. The PowerShell helper will then take that data and then go ahead and start the runbook. Now, running an Azure Automation runbook, we'll actually quickly talk about that now. Pretty much that is the orchestration component. So let's talk about runbooks. Wayne Hoggett actually did a talk on, and you can find it on the YouTube channel and the Brisbane PowerShell user group YouTube channel, on the usability of how to actually set up and configure Azure Automation. I'd strongly recommend it, watching it. I'm going to see if I can quickly grab it. Let's have a quick look. So if we have a quick look in here, it's this meetup here. So if we have a quick look in here, Wayne Hoggett did a really good talk on this. So I'm just going to post that in the link. So if you really want to get a good understanding of how to set up Azure Automation, it's a long stream. You can see it's 2 hours. There's a lot of content in there. And that will really kind of provide you a good kickstart guide on it. There's a couple of things. I made a few boo-boos on mine, but essentially, yeah, pretty much the same. So Let's quickly have a quick look at that. So essentially create an automation account, which essentially creates your runbooks. And we have a couple of runbooks in here. So when you create a configuration, you want to obviously add a, you want to write some PowerShell, because ultimately you need some PowerShell logic to be able to actually action the request. So in this instance, it's going to call set80 group role, or set80 role group. It's basically, you know, you got your get80 user, so it's just some basic PowerShell here, and then, you know, add that user to a role group, you know, super basic stuff. Ultimately, this has hybrid runbook workers. I don't think it's fully, this is kind of in a deprecated state now because I've deleted those machines. But there's some hybrid runbook worker groups that I've created, and a hybrid runbook worker group allows you to execute runbooks from Azure Automation runbooks within on-premise. So that's really the way that we got around be able to touch those on-prem products. Because ultimately, you can see here we're actually using on-premise Exchange. We're connecting to these things, and there's no network connection. The only way that we're actually touching those products is using our hybrid worker groups. Now, one of the things that we can do is, you're probably going to be wondering about configuration. Oh, sorry, credentials. How did I touch those services? So initially I had it set up, and this is not the way you do it. So I'm going to show you the way you don't do it, and we're going to show you the proper way and how to actually do it. So initially the way you don't do it is you can go to credentials in here, and you can create, no, it's not credentials, where is it? You can configure, essentially what you do, essentially what you can do is within here, you can configure your hybrid runbook worker to run under a different account, so a different server's account locally. So I've just used the runner's credential, and I just did it this way. Don't do that. So that is a big no-no. The better way to do it essentially is to, again, go ahead and create your credentials. So let's go back in here, and you can go down here to credentials, create your credential, and then within your actual PowerShell script itself, so if we go new AD user and we go edit, within your actual PowerShell script itself, you can create a parameter of the type PS credential, and then when you call the runbook, you just pass it the credential name. And what I mean by the credential name is, no, wrong one. If we go back to credentials, the credential name would be this, service account. So when you call the runbook itself and you just have that PS credential, you just pass that name, and then PowerShell, or then Azure Automation will actually inject this credential as a secure string into your PowerShell script, and you can then call the services using that credential. So basically, you're kind of decoupling it from a service account, and then it allows you to actually pass custom credentials. So for instance, if you need to connect to Exchange as this service account, if you needed to do this as another service account, it makes it a little bit easier. And that, to be honest, is a way better way of doing it, because it means that you don't have to, you're not creating essentially a large global admin, a domain admin account that basically has access to everything. You can create a single account for a specific task and then leave it at that. And that's pretty much that. Like, there's not really much else that's really configured in here. Everything else is pretty stock standard. It's just, you know, some scripts and that basically trigger it. So that's Azure Automation. If you guys got any questions, please throw them in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions. The next thing is, we've covered all that. So essentially what we've covered now is our dribble function, our helper, Azure Automation. We've covered that. We've covered our logic app. We've covered API management. The final thing we need to talk about is the client. This is where things get quite interesting. So the client. So you can see here, this is the HTML code for the client. It's pretty basic. And when I mean basic, I mean really basic. Initially, I wanted to use a little cat as a loader, but I thought I might get copyrighted, so I decided I'm not going to. So Yeah, that's fine. I just need to do that. Oh, I don't. Okay, that looked good. All right, so let's have a quick look at the HTML for the portal. And you can see here, it's really basic. Like there's 43 lines. So essentially, this is relying more on JavaScript to be able to actually build out the functionality and the HTML elements within the portal. You can see there is nothing on that page. It's a stock standard is what you're going to get. A couple of things to note is that we're using Microsoft Authentication Library and we're using version 1.2. Version 2's kind of out in preview at the moment. And that's added some other extra really nice little cool things. But ultimately, we're going to be working with version 1.2. Then we're going to have, we've got our custom, I've just got some custom JavaScript in here, which is what's used for all my stuff. And then obviously just load a bit of jQuery. And then the final one here is we're actually calling materialize. So how I made the page look so good was you reference a style sheet to Google's materialize. I'm not put it this way, I'm not a kind of a person who can make stuff look really good. In websites, I'm not a UI kind of guy. I'm just I'm a developer, and if everything was my way, then it will be console based. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Google materialized. I think it's materialized language. No, I'm just going to go to Google. Here we go. So this is Materialize. Now Materialize is essentially just the front end framework. Very easy to work with. Very, very easy to work with. So let's just have a quick example of how you actually do things. So you can see in here we basically we actually don't need that anymore, so we can go ahead and close that down. You can see in here we called the CSS, and then we just call the JavaScript down the bottom. And that's all you need to do to get started. And then basically, let's say you wanted to create a card. Just create a div, give it a class of teal lighten 2. Also card panel. You give it a class of card panel, and then basically after the space, that describes the color and then the shade of the color. And then within that, you go nuts. You can basically start adding I'm adding custom HTML elements to that. It's pretty straightforward. I like it a lot. It makes my life a lot easier because I don't particularly have to write UI intuitive code. I'm not a UI person at all. So let's have a look at another one because it's always quite interesting. So there's a lot that's in here. So for instance, let's have a look at the drop down. So you can see here you've got different things there, and you can basically create a drop down by creating a user list, giving it a class of drop down content, and then just adding list items, and that's pretty much it. And it'll render it. If you want to add like all those nice little like icons and things like that, basically within your list item, you can see here you just got a you've got a an icon. An I. I'll tell you what, I don't know what I is in HTML. I'm going to quickly look that up now. I, HTML. What's the I element? Okay. Okay. Markup text. Okay, it's just text markup. It's just, okay, italics. Okay, it's just italics. Okay, so essentially you can just create a, you can see, okay, so we've got, essentially just create a class, and then you call it, you create an italics, you call a class material icons, and then the value of that, what you want to use. So in this instance, view module will be number 4. That's that kind of icon there, and then 5 will be the cloud. So you can see, and that's pretty much it. Like, it's super easy to use. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get back to the code. So what we do here now is, you can see here, it's really straightforward. I've got a placeholder created, so essentially that's where all the content's going to get added. And then in here, I'm basically loading. I've got a little loader, which is basically a nice little loader bar. So if you go to, just go loader, preloader. It's actually a preloader. I've just got a determinate preloader that kind of runs. You can see there, just class and determinate div. As it is there. That's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward. And that allowed a nice little loader icon there. Don't have to do anything special. Anyway, so how does this all work in the portal? First things first, we need to talk about OAuth. OAuth is something that I think people kind of get a little bit confused about. So I'm going to try and simplify this as easily as possible. We've got tons of time. We've got an hour, so I reckon we'll probably spend about an hour on this. Maybe half an hour, depending how we go. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I could be here all day explaining OAuth. But we're going to really talk about the two main uses of OAuth. I'll say the two types of OAuth. So OAuth, for people who, when we talk about OAuth, I'm not talking about OAuth 1.0, which is basically you go into an application, you create a secret key, and that secret key is used in exchange, is used instead of your password. You basically use that secret key to obtain an access token. That access token then is all good to go. When I'm talking OAuth, I'm talking about the OAuth 2.0 standard. OAuth 2.0 is a little bit different to what OAuth 1.0 is. The reason why is because it introduced what we call a user authentication or user authorization. And so what happens is, let's jump into Paint. Oh, I've got to do it. Let's see if anyone's trying to. Okay, random. Okay, so what happens is, let's quickly go through OAuth. We're going to talk, firstly, we're going to talk about the user authorization flow. We're going to talk about two flows. There's two types that you can use. We're going to talk about the first type, which is the user authentication flow. So we have a user application here. Let's say it's a web page. It's trying to access a resource. That resource is obviously protected using OAuth. So the process that it needs to do is it needs to be able to obtain a token. So a token is basically a, it's basically used, it's exchanged for your password that basically can be used for a limited period of time. It usually has a lifetime of about 15 minutes. You can tweak it for a little bit here and there. And that basically is used instead of your password. Now, the token is, when you look at the token data, the token's just not a randomly generated string. The token data is actually encoded in a specific format, what we call JSON Web Token or JWT. I've got a really good demo on that, so we can actually have a quick look at that later. But that's just something that I just quickly want to mention. So it's not a random string; it's an actual encoded. It's an encoded token. So let's have a look at this. So what happens with our user flow is user needs to be able to request a token. So before it can even request a token with OAuth 2.0, the user needs to be able to authorize the application that it's accessing. So let's quickly go to talks. And let's quickly go and find class demo. Where's up here? There it is. I'm just going to quickly see if I can find it. Not this one. Pressing the token. So when you forget that. Okay, so when you see this, this is what I'm talking about. We need to go through an authorization process before we can acquire a token. The reason why this was done, which is kind of hilarious because most people just click accept anyway, is because it essentially allows you to, it needs to inform the user so the user is aware of what data it's accessing. Now you can see here, In this instance, this is a Microsoft Graph demo that I recorded. And you can see it needs to maintain the access to the data that it's been given access to and sign you in and read your profile. So it actually tells you what it's trying to do. Now, the way it does that is using what we call scopes. And scopes are essentially permissions that basically apply to the application endpoint. So if you wanted to, let's use Microsoft Graph, for example. If you need to access a specific user or a specific area of Microsoft Graph, you would need to add the required scope to the application permission to be able to do that. If you did it, you just cannot access it. And the really powerful thing is that when you actually go through this authorization flow, when you go through the authorization process, you can see it here. It says, do you want it? This app wants to have access to blah. So it's really, really important, to be honest, to always read what you're actually granting the application access. If you click cancel, it will not work. All right. We can probably use this as a bit of an example on how to actually acquire a token. So first thing we need to do is we need to actually acquire a token. But actually, one thing came to mind. Before we even do that, we need to actually set up our application. And I actually need to take a quick step back. I'm hoping that I have that done in a demo because it makes it a bit easier. Actually, no, we'll just do it live. We can just do it live. It's not going to be that long. So the first thing you need to do is you need to go to Azure Active Directory. And then we can go to App Registrations here. Wait for it to show up. And then we can create a new app registration. Now, we need to give it a name. So I'm just going to call this Tests. Now, one of the things that we're using is because we're using Microsoft Authentication Library, version 1.2 required that you needed to have multi-tenant turned on. If you didn't have multi-tenant turned on, you had single tenant, it wouldn't work. So it was just one of those little gotchas. But ideally, if you're ever using, creating an internal application, just use single tenant and your own tenant. Then basically you can add a redirect URI. We'll quickly come back to that. But the redirect URI essentially is used to by the authentication provider to send the authorization code back to. So let's quickly go ahead and register this. Okay, so we have our application registered. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a platform configuration. So let's just go ahead and we're going to add a single page application. The reason why we're using SPAs is because SPAs is really used for, in this instance, it's used because it allows Microsoft Authentication Library to actually be able to use it. So I'm just going to add a redirect URI. So I'm just going to go to localhost. One big gotcha is that this will not send a response to any URI that's a HTTP outside of localhost. Big gotcha. Also, this is case specific. So this is explicit. So if you have localhost like so, localhost when you're making requests in your headers and things like that needs to be the same. But to be honest, Microsoft Authentication Library is doing all the heavy lifting for us. We don't have to do any of this, so we can just go ahead and do that. And then we need to give some grant types. Now, one of the things you can see here is Microsoft Authentication Library does not support implicit grant anymore on 2.0. We're using 1.0, so we're going to turn on implicit grant. So when you upgrade to 2.0, just turn them off. And basically, it just allows you to request the token directly from the authorization endpoint. So yeah, go ahead and configure that. So that's all done. So what else do we need to do? Well, we actually need to create a scope. So this is where we need to create our scope. So we're just going to give it a URI, that's perfectly fine. Who can consent? We're just going to basically say admins and users. Now, user consent is what type of scope that it needs to have access to. So think of it as you might need to create a scope for the admin side of the IT self-service portal. The only people that could consent to that would probably be the admins only. However, if you're having just generic access, admins and users, anyone can get onto it. That's no problem. And then here we basically just going to go app. We're going to create a scope name called app read. Yep, it reads the application. I'll also say what is the application. And then basically, yep, and then we're going to do the same thing, copy that, paste that. And then we're going to give it a state, we're going to enable it. And now we have a scope. We've got a scope created for our authorization. Good to go. We can also add authorized client applications. So we can create custom scopes within our client applications and then import them in. And this way, I'm just going to do it this way. Once we've completed that, we're pretty much good to go. Like, there's not really anything else we need to do. We don't need to create client secrets or anything like that. That's used for admin consent, which we will talk about in a moment. And that's pretty much it. The final thing that you probably need to note is the client ID, the directory tenant ID. Those two things are quite important. And you'll see why when we actually look at the code, because you need the client ID to be able to associate what endpoint or what application you're trying to use. And then you need the tenant ID. The tenant ID is more used when you're actually doing custom REST requests and custom obtaining a token, because you will need to call different URL endpoints, and then basically within the URL itself is the tenant ID. So that's pretty much that. That's how we set up an application. It's that easy. So you can see that here, we're trying to actually log in here, and this is an actual legitimate URL that we're crafting to actually log in to obtain an authorization key. And you can see that's our access token, and then you have this custom URL endpoint. You've got the client ID, you've got the response type, the redirect URI. Redirect URI is quite important, and like I said, it's specific. So if you have a slash out of place, you're in trouble. It will have a problem with that. And then basically you can specify the scopes, what you would like to have access to. So let's go back to our OAUTH process. So we set up our application, and now we have this application here. So this is our, let's just call this our client application, and let's call this our server app. So once we have our client app and we got our server app, we're good to go. The server app has a client ID. I'm just going to call it 123. It has a tenant ID. I'm going to call that 345 just to make things a little bit different. And what's going to happen with the client is that it's basically going to hit a URL, and it needs to get an okay. So step one, it needs to get an authorized. It needs to log in and get an authorization. Now, it's going to get an authorization key. The only way to get it is to click allow on the approval process. So remember that approval process I talked about in the HTML form? When you click allow, that will generate an authorization key. That's the only way you can get an authorization key with a user, a client flow. So in an implicit grant, you don't need it. But anyway, that all aside. So once we're then going to get our login prompt, and we're going to get an authorization key. And that authorization key is going to get handed back to the client. And I'm actually going to show you guys that authorization key so you can actually see what it looks like. Now, the authorization key is going to get returned via the callback, by the callback URL. Callback. The redirect URI, sorry, the redirect URI. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because ultimately I think it's going to be quite in depth, but essentially the authorization key, when it gets returned via the redirect URI, that obviously needs to be included in this request. So when we're using Microsoft Authentication Library via JavaScript, we don't need to do any of that. Basically, we just don't, but it's always really handy to understand this. So So let's go have a look back at this video, because this is actually a really good example of what's going to happen. So if we quickly fast forward here, you can see here I'm crafting this URI. That's the URI that this initial first step is accessing here. So you can see here we've got a URI at the top there. It's trying to access that. You can see here we're logging in. We've got our approval. So if we click OK, I'm just talking about different things right now because this was a different thing. You can see trying to access it. If you're an admin or you basically have the policy, you can actually consent on the behalf of the organization. As a rule of thumb, turn this off, because what it means is that regular users, there's a policy where regular users can actually basically allow this. So again, if they're not thinking next, and it basically just gives full access to everyone, the rest of the organization will not get prompted for this, and they'll just immediately get an authorization key. Now, the first thing you can see here is that we're called back to localhost. That's the redirect URI. So what happens in the OAuth process is it sends the authorization key to the domain that you want to specify. So it'll send it back to your web server saying, hey, here's the authorization key, good to go. So once it's completed that, you can see inside there though, because it's it's essentially just a GET request that it's performing. It's got the authorization code there. And that code is what we need to be able to request a token, because that code is what is guaranteeing that the user has actually accepted the request. So you can see in here now, I'm basically just going through, I'm just manually ripping out the code for this demo so that people can actually understand the full process. And you can see it's URL encoded. It's just a URL query string. And then I'm going to paste that here. And then basically you see that's my authorization code. With all that information now, I'm actually able to now request a token. So once we have all that information, we have the client ID, we have the tenant ID, we have the authorization key, we're now able to request a token. Another thing about the authorization key is it also validates the user. So basically it validates that the user has, yes, indeed successfully logged in, but it also validates that the user has also approved the access to the application via those scopes. So what can happen now is that we can go ahead and request access to our resource. So we're going to go ahead and request a token. So you can see here, we're now going to request a token. In here, you're going to have literally everything you're going to pass in. It really depends on the API endpoint, because REST is really the Wild West, and OAuth is, again, it's generically an open standard. Microsoft basically expect everything, but we'll just assume that it's going to be that. So essentially, in this instance, you're going to have client ID, tenant ID, scope. You're going to have redirect URI, and you're going to have some other little properties, and then the auth key. So let's actually have a quick look at that. So you can see in here, we've built all that out. So we're going to go ahead, and now I'm just using Postman to do this because this was a demo that I was just giving to, as a beginning demo to people getting introduced to Graph. You can see here, I'm querying Microsoft's Graph endpoint. So this is the endpoint to be able to query this. With Microsoft, again, with Microsoft Authentication Library, you don't need to do any of this. It will do it for you. So this is why it's so great. You just kind of need to know about it. And then once you know about it, and if you ever have to do it manually, you know how to do it. But if you don't, you need to use the Microsoft Authentication Library. It's going to deal with all of it for you. So it's great. So I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs. I'm just seeing when I can get a token. So you can see here, I'm now just adding all the values to my Postman. I think it's going to fail because, yeah, the reason why it failed was because I waited for so long to get the authorization code. Sorry, I waited for so long. I kind of hung around doing this part, and the authorization code expired. So it has a lifetime. So if you basically copy and paste all this in, I'm just going to do this all again. Go and log in, blah, blah, blah. Grab that authorization code. We don't need to go through the ring roll again. And we then now go and actually send a request. We can get our token. So you can see here that you have token type, the scopes, the access token, and you have a refresh token. Now the access token is a, the access token is, like I said, is an encoded token. It's not just a random series of, it's not just a random series of characters. It's an encoded it's an encoded JSON web token, which contains a lot of information about the identity of the user, the user principal name, the audience, the scopes, the issuer. So the issuer is basically like who actually issued the token. All this kind of data is actually used. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about JSON web tokens, but essentially JSON web tokens have two components. They have a plain text and an encrypted side. And essentially what happens is to validate that token. So for instance, let's say because it's an encoded token, let's say I want to change what I have access to. So I'm going to add some scopes in there and be a nice little sneaky one. What can happen is that token, because it's changed and it's different to the encrypted component. So when the validation happens, and the validation happens in multiple areas, but essentially when the validation happens, essentially it looks at the two and goes, is this valid? Okay, is the issuer valid? All that kind of stuff. Is the token itself valid? Yep. Okay. And has it been modified any chance? And it'll just compare that against the encrypted component. And the encrypted component can only be read by the issuer, because the issuer issues it with a private key, and you cannot read it. It's just physically not possible. So that's tokens. So tokens are pretty, like, we can show you a quick token. So you can see here, Microsoft Graph, no demos, where's token, setting up a token, JSON web token. So you can see in here, we've basically just, this is a site you can actually use to kind of take a look at tokens. And you can see it's decoded the token. You can see the payload of the token, so the audience, the issuer, there's a whole bunch of other little bits and pieces in there. So it's not just a black and white thing. It also has headers and other things like that. Within the headers, you can see within Microsoft Graph, it has a nonce. This is one of the things I want to talk about, is you don't use Microsoft Graph scopes for your own application, because one, it's bad practice, but two, Microsoft Graph have a nonce. And then basically that nonce prevents replay attacks. So within the header, I can't validate that token. It's just physically not possible. So essentially you need to make sure that if you are, the token always needs to remain as is, in that sense if you're using Graph. But anyway, that's tokens. So once we have our token, which our token has been returned, we can then start calling our API endpoints. So we can start, in our instance, we can call the initialize endpoint. In this instance, we can actually, in this video here, we could actually call Microsoft Graph. So let's actually quickly see that. So you can see here, going through the whole rigmarole. You can see here I'm crafting my header. So I've got an authorization, bearer token. So that's pretty straightforward. And then in here, we basically, when I hit send, and you can see here I actually have a valid response because I have a valid token. I'm querying an endpoint that I have access to. The endpoint is valid. And yeah, so you can see here that's that. And that's pretty much that. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, so the next thing is, what am I going to talk about? Is code. We're going to actually talk a little bit more about the code. So what we might do is I need to take a quick gentleman's break. We'll be back in 5 minutes and we will carry on where we left off. So I'm going to take a quick little break and then we'll see you soon. Alrighty, we are back. Oh, don't need that. We got that one. All right, so welcome back. Let's carry on where we left off. Okay, so what is the next thing we need to do? So we need to talk about our portal. So we've literally covered OAUTH now, so we've got a bit of an understanding of how that whole process works. We can talk a little bit about the portal, and we can talk about the fun things about why Microsoft Authentication Library is way better, and we don't have to do this process manually. So let's get stuck into it. So, okay, we talk about that. We've got a custom login for that. Righto. Whatever. So essentially what we have here is our page HTML, a static HTML site, nothing super special there. And then we're going to go and have a look at our actual JavaScript itself. So the first one we need to look at is auth.js. All right. This is really the bread and butter when it comes to actually doing the whole auth process. So this script will get called. It has an event raised when the document's loaded. So obviously when the site's being loaded, it'll trigger, which will then start the actual login process. So the first thing that happens here is we can basically see here we're defining some configuration. Like we said earlier, we need that client ID. So that client ID is important to identify the actual application I'm accessing in our tenant. Now the interesting thing here is we don't actually need to specify our tenant because we're logging in. So essentially when we log in and put our username, joeblow@blah.com, and it's multi-tenant, it'll go, okay, it's this tenant, and then it goes and grabs that tenant ID, and that's why. Perfect. So the next thing is we're going to define our cache. So again, very straightforward. We're just going to say, hey, yeah, pop a cookie in. I'm all right. If you want to be explicitly and, you know, say no, don't put a cookie in, you can just change those. This again is all documented. So if we go to, actually, we'll quickly go to that Microsoft. So we go to Microsoft Authentication Library. You can have a quick look here where under here, JavaScript. So it's going to search JavaScript. Oh, here it is. As for .NET, where's for JavaScript? So there's different, obviously for different languages. That's quite handy. So here it is. So essentially, you can see in here, this is really good. Kind of tells you how it all kind of comes. Got some new stuff coming in. Fantastic authorization program with PKCE, all that kind of jazz. It's good. It's good stuff. So one of the things that, if you want to get the code, a lot of the source code is available on here. So if you go samples, we can literally just go Microsoft Browser samples, vanilla, JavaScript. You can literally just pull this apart and you'll figure out pretty quickly how it all kind of ticks. They've pretty much changed it. So we can actually, let's just have a look at IE7. So you can see here we're calling graph, we've got an auth.js, graph.js, and you can see in here if we go auth.js, it's very similar to what I have. I literally copy and pasted it and then just adjusted it. So the samples allow you to get up and running really quickly. It's very well documented, so I really strongly, if you're going to go use it, check it out. Another thing is that anyone who's using Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, should be using Microsoft Authentication Library. So Azure AADL, ADL is being deprecated, so now you need to use Microsoft Authentication Library instead. Microsoft Authentication Library instead. I was talking to a bottle. That's very practical. All right. So while we've got that going, let's go back and have a bit of a squiz at our code. So you can see I've got our client ID. We talked about that. And then what I've got here is my endpoint. So I've got two here. The reason why is because when I was doing testing, I was flicking between my local host and my actual and the actual API endpoint up in Azure. But essentially, I've just got an object that I've created. I've got two URLs, and I've got a method. It's pretty straightforward. You can see here, I've got a custom scope, which is just app.read. That's basically the only thing we need for this. This is a really basic application. It's literally just, to be honest, the scope should just be app.view. That's probably a better name for the scope instead of app.read, but anywho. So now we're going to be creating our event. So in here, we've got our event. So we've got document ready, and we're basically creating a function with that. So you can see the first thing here is we're creating a user an agent application using our configuration, which was up here. So again, just passing in the client ID, the cache, pretty straightforward. We're going to register a callback for the redirect. So that again is pretty straightforward. Like I literally, that's pretty much stock standard with the exception to my EIE and log, because I was trying to understand how it all ticked. But essentially this is used to handle any errors with the response, or any errors. It basically handles the callback component of the actual of the OAUTH process. So when that key is returned, here with the redirect URI, that's what it's handling here. So essentially here, we're just basically saying, okay, you got an error, or you're going to have a response. This is literally exactly what Microsoft have provided. You then basically can acquire a token and initialize. We also have, you can see here, and it's just calling that function, which is this one. So now this function obviously is responsible for creating a token, acquiring a token and then calling the initialize URL endpoint of the function app. So that response obviously is passed back through our callback, which then is passed into here, which will then basically call this, which then basically I can use that to acquire a token, and then basically invoke the actual REST method. this basically is if there's a user interaction required. This is more focused on IE stuff. I didn't really need to use it with Firefox, but if you're using IE, you basically, if it requires interaction for whatever reason, you kind of need to cater for that. The final thing after we've declared those functions is then we basically, down here, we actually call the login pop-up. And this is what actually creates, that actually creates the login pop-up. You can log into that endpoint. Once you've logged into that endpoint, fantastic. You go through the authorization component. Once that's all completed, it'll then basically acquire a token and initialize. So to be honest, we don't even need to, it'll just, so if it's successful, it'll then just acquire a token and then initialize. So with the response. And that's pretty much that. So now, there's another function here, which we have the Azure Function Initialize callback. Where is that? So when we acquire a token and initialize the REST method, I've just declared to call this function, which is down here, to basically call that function once it's completed. So once this function, once this token and the REST request has been completed, it'll actually pass the response. It'll actually pass the deserialized response into this function. And you can see here, so what it's going to do is it's going to basically accept that. We're going to set that variable, and then we're going to call render configuration. So that's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go take a look a little bit more in depth at the REST components here. So the first thing we can see here is acquire token and acquire token and invoke REST method. So sounds pretty straightforward. You've got URL, you've got your method, you've got your callback method, and you've got your body. So if you choose and you need to use the callback method, which most of them do, you basically can pass that through. Actually, no, it's mandatory. Sorry, that's mandatory because you need to be able to get you need to pass the response back for some reason. Unless you don't, and then it'll just be null. Anyway. And then you have the body of the request if needed, and then the actual response. And so the response, the body. The response is generated in here. So you just need the URL, the method, the callback method, and the body. So it's very, very basic. So the first thing it does is it acquires a token. So it calls this method. This is the method that's responsible for actually acquiring the token. So if we go back to our paint diagram here, this is what requests the token. So again, we don't need to do this. This is already done on, this is done through JavaScript. We just need to acquire the token. Once the token's been acquired, we can then invoke our REST method. Again, just calling the URL, the method, the callback method, the body, and then the response. And the response is basically, this is the token response. So once we have that content, we actually have a valid access token that we can use. So once we have that token, we can actually do things. Obviously, if there's an issue with it, it'll log an error. So, okay, and it will basically go back to, it will try and acquire a token using the pop-up method, which basically means it will actually require you to log in again. So it's exactly the same, except it's just going to have another crack at it, and it'll try and do it using acquire a token pop-up. If that fails, then the user has put in the wrong credentials, or there's something wrong with the configuration, things like that, and then the process will stop. Most of the time, this will obviously work because we can actually go ahead and get a token that way. So that's basically calling it. Obviously, I'm very PowerShell here, so invoke REST method was the function I decided to call within JavaScript. So obviously we've got invoke REST method, URL method, callback method, body, token response. Very straightforward. So if it has a callback method, we're basically going to register a function, and then we're going to call back. We're going to call that callback method, and then we're going to pass the JSON. We're going to deserialize the JSON for it, and deserialize the JSON, and then pass that JSON in the response as in the response of that specific method. Go ahead and create the session. So create a new XML HTTP, create an access token. So create a header with the access token, make sure it's a bearer. Obviously, we're just passing the token response that was up in here with the access token. Add the body. If the body is included, it'll basically add the body, and then it'll send it that way. Now, interestingly, if you use XML HTTP.body and add the body that way, it had issues. So the only way I could actually do it was actually send the body that way. So that's fine. And then if it doesn't, just send the request. It's obviously a GET. There's nothing wrong with that. So go ahead and do that. And that's really it. Like, it's just sending a REST request to the endpoint. What else? So the final thing is obviously if we go back to the portal, we now have triggered our endpoint. We've gotten the configuration, because when we trigger the initialize, when it's calling initialize, which if we just quickly go up here, so we go initialize callback, where's initialize? Acquire token initialize. We got API configuration, function endpoint, function method. Where is this? API management. Oh, sorry, here it is. Yeah, so basically it's called that endpoint and that method. So very straightforward. Once it's completed that, obviously it's triggered our function app, which has basically said, okay, it's validated the token. It's got a token. And then basically it will then go and call our helper, which basically loads the configuration, brings it back into our durable function, which then returns it to our client. And then in here, you can see here now it's going to call render configuration. So this is where things get a little hairy. So yeah, this is where it all kind of goes, gets a little complicated. So let's go to portal.js. So this is where pretty much everything for creating a this is where how the actual page gets rendered. And what it does is essentially now it has the configuration. It will basically use that configuration to create the HTML elements on the page. So we'll minimize this one for the time being, and we'll go straight to render configuration. So the first thing you can see there is we've got that parameter that we're passing in. So just configuration items. Okay, cool. And then what we're doing is we're getting our placeholder. So I have a placeholder. If we quickly go here, you can see we have a placeholder div. So we're just going to go ahead and get that div. And once we've got that div, we're just going to quickly run remove tile. And so that basically just ensures that there's nothing in there, and it's just going to flush that out. So if there's any sort of HTML elements or anything like that in there, they're all being removed. Once that's completed, we're then going to go through each of the configuration items and make sure that those configuration items are added to that, as a tile to the page. So you can see here, what we're doing is we've got our, we're basically just creating an object of the HTTP content, the tile ID and the tile index. So the index is obviously a configuration item. Within JavaScript, it's actually it's an integer, so it's not an actual object, where in PowerShell, if you had a for each, it would be an object, but in this instance, it's an integer. So we're basically just referencing all that content. Since we have the configuration, we can basically build the configuration item, have the HTTP content, put the type in that. So basically what we're doing is we're creating a unique ID for each of those specific HTML elements. So when the user makes a change on the page, we're able to associate that specific HTML element back to the configuration itself. So once we've completed that, you've obviously created an index, which is just, yeah, that's an ID. We then call new tile. If there's an issue, it'll throw an error. Yeah, and that's pretty much that. So let's have a quick squiz at new tile. What you're going to expect for any sort of element creation within JavaScript. So obviously you've got HTTP content, tile ID, tile index. So within here, you basically obviously creating some divs, creating attributes, blah, blah, blah. This is pretty straightforward within JavaScript. You're just creating elements within JavaScript. Following that, there's a couple of little things that we've done. that I did. Now, this is not the most effective. There's a lot of better ways. Like it literally, this engine only supports 2 types of elements for a form box rendering, which is just select and text boxes, but it still works. Still works. But anyway, so you can see here we're creating our owners. Now, one thing about the owners is that because there's multiple owners, we need to basically, we just create it as a list item. And you can see here, if we have a look, where is body owners? You can see it's a, body owners created. Title set attribute. Class, card title. Where's the element itself? Here it is here. So it just creates it, and it's just a user list. So essentially just creates it in there. But with the beauty of materialize, materialize basically essentially creates a will do all the rendering for us. So you can see here I'm just setting an attribute and I'm giving it a disk. That's basically saying to the CS and to materialize, hey, I want to make it look like this, and it'll just do that. So it makes it really easy for rendering things. So once it's done that, it'll add all the owners, and then this is really where it kind of comes down to the be all and end all, which is building the form data. So essentially what happens is it'll go through each of the configuration items within the form. So if we quickly go back to our configuration, you can quickly go back into here. You can see we basically can have multiple configuration items that can be rendered. So you can have a username, we can have a value for that. So what that means in here is that basically we need to render each of those items within the form. So what we're going to be doing here is that essentially we're going through each of those specific items and then basically creating that. So you can see within here, we basically have our element type. So all that information is provided in the configuration, and it'll just go ahead and dynamically create that based on that. So the element type, it sets the ID. So again, the ID needs to be set to that. So it generates a unique ID. Little gotcha is that if you use that method of strings, I can't remember what it's called in JavaScript, it doesn't work in Internet Explorer. That's a fun little one for you. I actually wrote this specifically not for Internet Explorer, but so if you're using this in Internet Explorer, that's a gotcha right there. That'll cause the JavaScript to fail because it doesn't. I can't remember what that's called, but it's not supported. So you can see here just setting some classes and things like that, and then basically we're appending it. Now, one thing here is that you can see that we've got different types of element types. So if we go back to our configuration, you can see here we've got one as a type input and one's a type select. So it's going to head and it's going to go create that element type. That's no problem. However, it treats it differently when there's different things. So if it's a type select, it's obviously going to be a type select because it's created it from that configuration, that element type property. However, what it needs to do here is it basically needs to go ahead and go, okay, we need to create options within that element, or that select element, so that basically it can be treated as a drop-down box. So that's really what's happening here, is that it's going through and it's going, okay, going through each of the options within the values. So it's going through each of these values, and then basically it's just creating an HTML element option and then appending it to the actual element type. Now, if it's an input, it basically is just going to add it as a placeholder. So if there's a value in there as a placeholder, so this is a good example, you've got username, values would be treated as a placeholder. So it'll just render that as a nice little placeholder text that can sit there, which looks really nice. Like it looks really, really quite nice. And then once that's all done, essentially what will happen here is it'll append the child, it'll append it all together, bring it up, build it all up, and then basically it'll then finally build the submit icon and then build the submit button. One thing that's important here is you can see I'm calling submit request. We'll go through that later, but essentially it's passing the tile index. So that tile index is what was passed when we actually called new tile. That associates that specific HTML element to that data set. So essentially we're able to kind of join the dots here. Once that's completed, it'll then go ahead and append the child. So yeah, and that's pretty much it. Obviously, show the load screen, hide the load screen. That's not really that hard to talk about. This one's a fun one. This is a fun one. We'll talk about that when we go through the submit. So the final rule one is submit. And this is where users made a change. The form's been rendered. It looks great, looks good. Now we're going to actually submit the request. So let's go have a look at that. So you can see the first thing that's done is the tile index value. That's that index value that we placeholdered onto the actual button itself. You can see in here, we're going to load the HTML object. Basically, first things first, we're querying that data. So we're going to our cached configuration. We're going to go grab that ID. And then using that, we can actually start to construct our REST body response here. So we've got our type. So we're getting our type. We're basically getting the name selected. And then basically, we created essentially an array for the parameters that need to be passed back. This is really the cool part. So what we can do here is, we can iterate through each of the parameters and then add them to the body of that. So essentially, we're just going through each of those form items that we added, and then basically adding them to this. So the way we do that is we basically get the object. Obviously, again, that's pretty straightforward. We need to get all the parameters. And then what we need to do is perform a lookup and get the HTML configuration item of that. Now I'm just going to show the shortened version of that. So if we go back to our configuration file in here, we're working within this section right now. So we know we have the type, we have all that content. Just quickly go back. And we have the HTML name here. So you can see here, we know the HTML name. That HTML name is associated to this parameter. So we're actually able to make a connection between the two. So what happens here is that when we call getHTMLConfig, it's basically able to perform a link-based search to find the HTML objects within the configuration of the request to HTML name. So what it's basically doing is it's going through each of these specific parameters, trying to find, is equal to HTML name is equal to that, return this. So you can see here, you can just go HTML content, HTML config, filter, function item, return HTML name is equal to HTML name. So then we get the configuration item here. And once we get the configuration item, then basically, if it's the length is 0, then return nothing. That's bad news. If it's not, then basically actually return the object itself. Now you have to actually return an index 0 because this is always assuming it's an array. So even if it's an int, even if it's even if there's a one item or an array, it's still an array. So that's why we have to do that. But that's pretty much really what it does. Very fun piece of code. That was like one of my highlights of JavaScript within this project. So once we've completed that, we can then basically, we're just going to remove, so if the response was null, we're just going to remove it. We're going to basically ignore the actual request. To be honest, this is where we probably should throw an error, that kind of thing. But at this point in time, I was literally probably a couple of weeks before, and I was kind of at the end of my rope. So I was kind of like, it'll be fine. We'll just kind of finish it with that. But anywho, so once we've completed that, we then will construct the element ID. And this is based on the data that we have. We now have the type, we have the HTML name. We can actually construct the elements that we need to get the data from. And then basically, obviously, go find the element. We've dynamically set it, so it should be there. If it doesn't, we have a problem. And then basically, once we know what type of element it is, we might need to do different things with it. So for instance, if it's a text box element or an input, we just need to use the value. If it's a select, we're going to need to go and get the selected index value. So what was actually clicked on the drop-down box. If there's something wrong with it, obviously it's going to say, something's not right. And then finally, then it's going to dynamically add that parameter name and the value to the body of the request. And so once it's done that, obviously we'll loop through each of the parameters, and then we have a completed body request. And then all we need to do is basically send a request, so acquire token and then invoke a REST method, and then basically call the response URL. So in the actual HTTP content, there will be a response URL. So if we quickly go back in here, we should be a response. Actually, no, the response URL will be encoded when we actually respond. HTTP object, HTTP content, response URL. Oh no, it isn't there. So if you go down here, there'll be a response URL, and this is basically what it will call back. So essentially, it'll just be called back that it'll call back that HTTP start function app that we talked about earlier. Whoops. And then once it's done that, it'll then submit a toast. And a toast from Materialize, it's same as toast, toast in PowerShell. It's just makes a nice little thing on the side there saying, "Hey, toast, I'm a toast." So you can kind of get the jazz there. So they'll just post that up. So let's actually have a quick look at that whole process end to end in a video. Again, I'm just kind of like, this is very informal, so I'm just kind of going to go through the. It's not a solution. It's in presentation, demos, videos. And so here we go. So you can see here, we can go to our API endpoint. We basically had, okay, so you saw, we'll just quickly back up for a sec. You saw this pop up. So even though I was cached, I was cached on the, I already signed in, so my request was cached. So I actually it automatically popped up and disappeared. But essentially what would have happened here would be is you got a login form, you have to go through and actually physically sign into your tenant, approve the request, good to go. Once you've completed that, obviously it would then make that subsequent request. Obviously you have your configuration that's now returned. It's obviously, configuration returned. The function app's compiled that configuration and then sent it to you. And then obviously using that configuration, you can then create your HTML elements using the JavaScript to create these nice form. And within here, you can see now we can, I'm actually looking, I'm doing something. Oh, that's right. I'm jumping on my domain controller because we're actually going to add a user to a group. So if we go to Abby Hopkins and we click on, I'm just grabbing an email address, I think. You can see here, and then what I'm going to do is, you can see the owners, that's all pre-populated, and then we can just add Abby Hopkins at catcorp.com, and then I can select my role group that I want to add her into. So we just go system. I think it was, I can't remember what I added. I think it was payroll. You can see we've clicked submit request. So obviously what's happened is it's gone, pulled the HTML or the data from the specific element, matched it to the configuration. All is good. Obviously it's submitted that URL to the request. There's no feedback on this, so we can't actually query anything. To be honest, we could actually get that info because remember the instance ID that's returned from the function app, we can actually query the state of the durable function. So that's definitely possible. So if you wanted to have a future version, that would be definitely possible. And you could just basically have like a little tab here or something like that. You could, to be honest, I would just have it asynchronously working in the background. Actually, no, you probably have a tab or something where you can actually see all the requests that you sent. But the problem with that is that basically then you're going to need to actually start caching additional, you need to cache each of those URL requests somewhere. Obviously, I'm just going to wait for the Flowbot to basically say, hey, g'day. You can see it sent a card. Hey, do you want to approve it? So we're going to click approve. Now, remember, this is basically the durable function app's basically gone through. It's validated the configuration. It's validated the token. All that's all good. And then basically once it's completed all that content, once it's completed all that, then it's basically triggered the logic app. And then it's paused. So the durable function is actually paused right now. It's waiting for the approval here. So when we click approve or deny, remember within this card itself, it has a custom class, which basically provides the callback URL, the URL that it needs to trigger to send the approval back to our durable function app. And then, yeah, some other little bits and pieces in there. It's like the instance ID as well and things like that. So click approve. We can just say, yep, that's all good to go. So once that's all good to go, you can see here, it takes, like, my Teams was broken at this point in time. For some reason, it just wouldn't update. So if you refresh the page, it actually, you can see that it's submitted. And one really good thing about this was as well is that essentially it would send the approval request to all the owners, so you could have multiple owners. So essentially in that instance, it would be first in best dress. So if one of the owners looked at it and denied the request, it didn't matter if the other one approved the request, because then basically the Drupal function app would invalidate the actual the request, and that's just because that was the first request that made it. Then after that, the instance ID, like the that specific run within the Drupal function is stopped. And you can see here, then finally, once it's done all that, it's obviously triggered our helper. It's constructed the parameters for the runbook, and then it's gone ahead and then created a it's then gone ahead and ran the PowerShell within the runbook, which is obviously a hybrid runbook worker on premise, in which then basically targeted our Active Directory and then added that user to that specific role group. And that is it. A massive, massive session. How long have I been going for? How long have I been streaming for? What does restream tell me? It says, well, 2 hours, 3 hours. So that was one hell of a workshop or a deep dive. So I know there's a few people that joined in. G'day Core, g'day Brett. I know that you guys joined in. Obviously, I know 4Bob's lurking. And there's a couple other users that decided to jump in as well. I can kind of see users jumping in, coming and going. So obviously, a lot of this is going to be, you can replay it on YouTube. I actually have to do some bits and pieces on that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So do you guys, does anyone have any questions with regards to anything, or any other questions regarding to Azure Functions or Function App? Brett's also on stream, which basically means that he might be able to answer some of these as well, so if I can't. So I'll leave that open for a little bit. Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to be wrapping up in the next couple of minutes anyway, because I definitely hit my quota. I said 9 o'clock and it's 0900 here in Brisbane. So, yeah. Let's see, I don't think anyone's putting any questions in, so that's fine. We'll quickly talk about what's happening next week with the stream. I think I might still be working on my Function App, because I still got a fair bit of stuff to do with my Azure Sentiment Function App. It's been being converted into a Drupal Function App. However, we're going to do some testing on that. So that's what's going on there. I also have a bit of a particular interest in the Microsoft DSC configuration PowerShell module. Sorry, the DSC configuration. The Microsoft 365 DSC module, which essentially allows you to download 365 settings. So I'm going to be having a bit of a look at that. Trying to get added, just to see what's going on in that, because we actually use it for quite a bit for work. So that's going to be something that I'm going to be probably getting involved in the future, to try and make sure that we can get some support, not just support, but to get some, try and push some features that we want to actually see included in the module into that. So yeah, but yeah, I think since there's no questions, I think we might just leave it there for today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. That was one hell of a stream to explain how to build an IT self-service portal. But again, I'm just going to repost the YouTube links. If you weren't there earlier, you can pretty much see these. That's basically a YouTube link to Azure Automation, how to properly set it up with Wayne Hoggett. And if you actually want the solution, you can go to that link there, and you can have a bit of a look at the code yourself. So those are generally, yeah, those two links are really kind of get you started and get you kicked off. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Lots of content, but we got through it all, which is great. Yeah, hope to see you guys next time. Anyway, bye.